Welcome to Writers on Recovery, conversations and readings from the newest issue of Bellevue Literary Review. I'm Danielle Ofri, Editor-in-Chief of BLR, and this is the Bellevue Literary Review. If you don't know BLR, we are a literary journal that publishes creative writing about health, illness, and healing. We've been publishing for more than 20 years, and you can find us on the web and social media at BL Review. This 43rd issue of BLR is devoted to the theme of recovery, and here's the issue with cover art by artist Lauriston Avery. When we first came up with the idea of recovery as a theme, COVID-19 didn't even exist, and we were thinking of recovery in more general terms. But by the time we were reading submissions, the pandemic was in full swing, and suddenly there was this medical urgency to recovery. By the time the issue actually came out this fall, of course, the pandemic has begun to recede from the acute panicky phase into more of just how life is. And so recovery as a theme ended up being quite a bit multidimensional, and we saw that in the submissions we received with writings about medical recovery, political, environmental, economic, societal, personal. We were so very impressed by the variety and quality of writings that we received for this issue, and we're thrilled to present several of the writings today. 3 of the writers from this issue will be interviewed by BLR editors and also read from their work, and then we'll have 3 additional poets read their poems. Today, we're going to start with poetry. We're so pleased to present the work of poet Rochelle Robinson Dukes. Rochelle is a professor of English at the City Colleges of Chicago, and she's the editor of Brownstone Barrio Bards, a journal of Chicago poets, and she's been published in African American Review, the Carolina Quarterly, Atlanta Review, Meridian, and Salamander. Rochelle will start us off by reading her poem, My Friend in Flapping Stages Tries to Take Flight, and then she'll be joined in conversation with BLR Assistant Poetry Editor Omotara James.
April is my favorite month. Its stormy flowers and puddled rainbows are captivating, as is the lightning that breaks cool spring nights like a child's scribble. The crackling sound slides between raindrops like cold feet in flannel sheets. Electricity in whitish, rapid Southern Baptist church claps. I run through it. But when you twist it like a lipstick plant, became a true epiphyte, then an origami ostrich, hopping on one leg before biting your lip on your descent between the kitchen and the dining room. I ran to you to catch you. Your seizure scattered the cats like marbles, placed you firmly in the ER for 4 hours, and pushed memory from you just out of reach of the date of your name. So your life has to change. You had to admit, I guess I really have epilepsy. Something we learned 4 years ago. But it was the cutting off knowledge that happens when the brain misfires that shook you like wet leaves on a most deciduous tree, a beech, a maple, or oak, holding drops like pearls preciously, or pills epileptics must take even when they feel free, like the natural force in a charged midnight monsoon.
Wonderful. So thank you again so much for reading your poem. It's great to hear it in your voice. It was such a delight to see it in the pile of submissions. And there's so much I want to say about it. There's such a beautiful tension in the language. You have this in this poem an overarching gratitude and love that seems to be like seamlessly thread throughout the language. And so I just want to ask you just a few questions about how it's come into existence. But first, how did it feel to read?
I don't think I've ever read that poem aloud. I showed it to a few people, but I've never read it. And I always love reading this, my words. So that was really, that was a gratifying feeling. So I appreciate that. Thank you for that.
Thank you for sharing that with us. I mean, it's beautifully arranged on the page, but when I hear the language, I can I can hear like this kind of slow, steady song-like quality that it has, which I really appreciate. And one of the things that I so enjoyed about this poem is that it engages the reader's different senses. There's the language that you hear, the generous, like lush botanical language. And there's also like the imagery of the flowers and the leaves, but then there's like the sound, the crunching. And then because there's so much flower and like tree vocabulary and the maple, I feel like I can almost smell it at times. So it really engages all of the senses and kind of captivates that way. And so the first thing I wanted to ask you about this poem is, how did it come into existence? Like, what was the urge to write it? Was it to re-enter a moment like in time that happened, or was it really like an offering? Because there's so much protection that I feel in this poem. I feel like it's a generous response and almost a way of the way the speaker treats the subject. It feels like the speaker wants to offer the subject something. So if you could just speak on that.
I love that you mentioned offering. I hadn't thought of it that way before. This poem actually is paying tribute to a friend of mine who actually had an epileptic episode, or second, on Good Friday. And so it was, right before Easter. And I always try to write an April poem because that's my birthday month. And, it's the beginning of spring. And so when I wrote the poem, it was really about her and her spouse and about this event occurring because, she had forgotten to take so many pills that she needed to take a day. And every time that holiday comes around, Good Friday comes around, Easter comes around, I think about this. I think about how close I came to losing my dear friend. And it really puts me in perspective of, what are these precious moments that we share in life with people and how they can be taken away. Every spring, I think about, the offerings, the blessings of, being alive, seeing the trees change, seeing things blossom, but also tying it to religion, or how, Jesus died on Good Friday and rose from the dead. And my friend had an episode that could have taken her out, we could have lost her. And I see this as me paying homage to her and letting her know, yes, you are an epileptic. You need to take those meds. We need you here. And
yes.
So I never thought of it that way, but thank you for giving me that offering now. She would, when I sent it to her, she was appreciative of it, but I was appreciative that she was still here.
And that, when you speak about the fact that, the poem, like you wrote it in April, and it's something that you return to, we think about every April, there does seem to be this like almost supernatural quality to the language and the mood of the poem, the electricity, right? And so that works on many levels, that motif of electricity and the body and epilepsy and the seizures. And it's not overwrought. It's really well done. It's really subtle, but I wanted to ask, when we, as poets, when we write about either real things or thoughts and thought experiments, the way that we use language is so important because, well, Toni Morrison says, language alone protects us from the scariness of things with no names. And so when you juxtapose that idea of what language can do and how it can protect us with also when you receive a diagnosis and how scary that can be, because then, your symptoms have a name. And so holding space for the idea of language protecting us from what we don't know, but also naming that scary certainty. I wonder, as the author of the poem, did you have something, or do you have something in mind for what you want the poem to do in the world? I think we all have a hope for, what we want our poems to do. But do you have like a secret wish or a hope for how the poem will live, outside of the relationship of you and your friend?
Well, here's what I find interesting. I'm surrounded by a lot of people, and she brought this to my attention when she first had her first seizure 4 years ago, who have quote unquote hidden disabilities. She always says she has a hidden disability. And I have relatives that have hidden disabilities, diabetics, high blood pressure. So you can't see it. And she always talks to, people about how, hidden disabilities are something that, it can be a strength. It can be a superpower. And I just want people to be more comfortable in the different various parts of themselves that the world may see as a weakness, but it's actually a strength. Let me give an example. My son is a diabetic. And because of that, he learned at an early age, at 10, he's wonderful with math. His math skills are phenomenal. So he had to know how to rationalize what units of insulin to give himself upon diagnosis. So he's actually a math major in high school. He goes to Math and Science Academy, and he has the propensity for the numbers. So that helped him to be able to give himself shots and regulate his pump and do all this on his own. And I'm grateful for that. But his math ability is also a strength, as is his ability to handle his secret or hidden disability, which he doesn't see as a disability. He talks about it. He's not ashamed of it. When he used to use needles, what are you doing? Giving myself insulin. So I want people to be more stronger around what they're dealing with, because it does help us. It does make us more capable in this world. I often believe that my mom, who had Alzheimer's, prepared me for any type of health crises I had to deal with my friends or my family.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you for that insight, because as I hear you speak about invisible disabilities and how your son has used his, natural intelligence and abilities for math to kind of reframe his diagnosis, or vice versa. What I'm hearing is that like poetry, and this poem in particular, can be a lens through which we not only view ourselves and our bodies, but also how we view ourselves in relation, to each other and the greater world. And that, to me, that's remarkable. What more can you ask for? Wow. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah,
that's amazing. And I did a little bit of research on you, and and I see that you've been teaching for many years English in Chicago. Am I correct? You're coming to us from
English and literature at the City Colleges of Chicago, specifically at Olive Harvey College.
Shout out. Wonderful. And, so like, and I too, I adjunct. And so I was wondering, like when you're sitting down to write a poem, this poem, or I read a couple of your other poems online, which were wonderful. There's one for George Floyd. I wonder, yeah, which was also wonderful. And I wonder for you, we each have a different praxis, a practice of sitting down and writing and responding to the world. And in this poem, you so skillfully respond to, your friend's seizure. And I'm just wondering, in general, how did you come to poetry, and who are you writing for, and what keeps you motivated? So maybe that's 2 or 3 questions, but just whatever you feel comfortable answering. How did you come to poetry, and who are you writing for, especially thinking of the work you do as an educator?
Well, I started writing poems when I was 8. And in high school, I knew right away I wanted to be an English major, so I took honors English classes. When I went to undergrad, that's where I got my mentor, Kevin Stein. He used to be the poet laureate for Illinois. He stepped down, I can't remember how many years ago, 2017, I think. And I started, really getting into reading and writing poems. We had a guest speaker come in, and it was Gwendolyn Brooks. And she lives in Chicago, and she was the poet laureate, when she came to visit. And for a while, I was sending her my poems in undergrad, and she would respond to some of them and write back. Wish I had those letters right now. And that really helped me try to hone in on the image. An image comes to me first, and then I build around that image. So I think with the poem about my friend, the cat scattering was the image that came first, like marbles. Because she has 2 cats. And ironically, one of her cat is a disabled cat. This cat was thrown out the window, has a spine injury, and walks funny. So for that cat to scatter like a marble, that shows the fear that the cats had when the seizure actually happened. So I build around that image. And I always try to teach my students in my Poetry 111 class that you want to try to touch as many senses as possible. I didn't realize I touched all those senses until you mentioned them, but I always tell them, of course, you're going to touch sight, but if you can get sound and feeling and maybe some people have even worked taste in, but I try to get at least 3 of the senses in when I'm crafting, when I'm building, when I'm scaffolding the poem. So I usually teach it that way. Whatever the image is, go from there, try to build around it. Sometimes the image is in the middle, sometimes it's the last line of the poem, and I have to work my way back. But usually the image is what does it, and then I have to think of what is the narrative. What is this image going to tie to that has happened in my life, that's happening in the world, that's happened to somebody else? And then what's going to be what will people feel what are they trying to get out of it? How will they connect? And usually it's, something that affects maybe a small percentage of people, but I don't care how many people I reach, just as long as someone can gain something from the poem, because I gained something from the feeling that inspired me to write the poem.
That comes through. It certainly does. And even, when I just returned to the last lines of the poem, like the natural force in a charged midnight monsoon, what I love about those lines is that there isn't an unnatural separation or disconnection between the subject, your friend who had the seizure, and the natural world. There is, and I find so often with illnesses that are chronic or disabilities in society, there's that stigma that acts to remove people from the world, that acts to segregate people. And what I love about this poem is that there's seemingly, even though there's a tension between, diagnosis, like the reality of the diagnosis, and like the freedom, of just, like existing in a body. There's, so we have the body itself is a constraint. So we're working within that constraint of a body, but the language of the poem, which begins with April being the favorite month and the flowers and the lipstick plant, even when the speaker is looking at the subject and saying, you twisted like a lipstick plant, but still that's natural language connecting the subject to the world. It really feels like such a reclamation of the body and the spirit being connected to the natural world, no matter what state. And that is an act to me of great, great generosity. And another reason that I just really appreciate this poem existing in the world. So it's, it was such a pleasure to take. And it's my hope that this poem continues to be shared and, people can see like the grace of existence in this poem, which is what comes through to me so clearly. And I just wonder, just thinking about all that, how, I think as an author, we write, we make an offering, and then, that offering comes back to us. And so I just wonder, how have you been changed just by your practice of writing, or how this poem, has it changed you in any way when thinking about, yourself, your body, just how you see like the role of the poet, in the world?
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned the connection to the natural world, because I wanted to make that link of the electricity of energy. Energy never dies. And energy resides within us and the natural world. And the lightning that is in April storms is the same lightning or spasm that's coursing through someone's body to create movement or seizure or anything. And as a poet, I now make sure that I take time out to commune with nature more. Every day I give myself 2 hours to walk. Wow. I walk 2 hours, whether it's winter, spring, summer, fall. In the snow or the rain, I go walking and I watch the leaves and I watch the trees and I take pictures. And I'm in a neighborhood group where people who are retired in their 70s send us flower pictures every day. So that's what I'm trying to do more, communing with nature so that my mind can be still and rest. And I find when I'm walking, sometimes a line will come to me. I'll write that line in my phone and then keep on walking. And later on, that line can be something that I can put in a poem that I can offer in another offering to someone else. So I think that this has made me more of I don't want to say I'm trying to be a transcendentalist and go back to nature.
Why not?
Because we know that that experiment they had at Fruitdale that failed a little bit when they tried to have their own community. But I think that, I agree that nature can help us transcend it. It's the closest connection to God you can get without another person trying to be a mediary. And so I like going out and seeing if I can plug a poem out of nature. And I used to have my students do that all the time. Let's go outside and walk around the trees and see what you can find in the world and write out.
Thank you. Yes, this poem functions that way, and it serves to connect. And I feel like deeply connected to your friend, to you, to the language. And I'm just so grateful that, it connected us here today so that we could have this conversation. And I guess my last question is, do you have any burning desire to share anything that I haven't asked about the poem or your writing or, BLR?
Well, and I really appreciate this opportunity. I mean, I have not had to ever read a poem and then discuss it, but, I tell my students that when I teach the lit class, the poetry class, they have to perform. I want them to get some performance platform skills. I used to have them go to a poetry place and they'd have to perform there. But we went out the theater into college and they perform. And I just think that my calling as a teacher, as an educator, is to practice what I preach. So if I'm going to teach poetry, I have to submit poetry, go through the rejection process. I have to perform. I have to show them, as I tell them, I can show you better than I can teach you. So I'm going to show you how to be a poet. And so they try to emulate that. And some of them go on and publish their own stuff or start submitting. So I think that, I feel like this is it's kind of a full circle moment. I get to I'm a student of poetry, and now I'm a practitioner of it. And this has given me a platform to actually do that. So I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Oh, it is our pleasure. Thank you so much. And that's the wonderful thing about poetry, is that you can continue to be a student. You teach and the world teaches you, and it's cyclical. And, you really give, you get back what it is that you give. So thank you so much again for this offering. And we're thrilled to have published this poem. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Hopefully I can keep communing with nature and keep writing poetry.
Oh, please. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rochelle. Thank you, Omotara. That was wonderful. We'll now turn to fiction. Julia Mascioli's fiction has been published in Witness and the Bellingham Review. She co-edited 2 anthologies, When You Hear Me, You Hear Us, Voices on Youth Incarceration, and The Untold Story of the Real Me, Young Voices from Prison. She has an MFA in fiction from Emerson College. Julia will read an excerpt of her story, In the Bone, and then she'll be joined by BLR fiction editor Suzanne McConnell.
The only reason Isaac wasn't a heroin addict was because he was petrified of putting a needle in his arm. He couldn't stand the idea of rupturing his skin. Alcohol was easier. It used to be. Isaac was 12 years sober when his son Peter was hospitalized for aplastic anemia, a rare condition, the doctor said, in which the body stops producing red blood cells. The weeks of fatigue and fevers had taken a toll on the boy, but when the doctor told them his son needed bone marrow, Isaac was the one who felt like he was withering. His wife, Zosha, started in with questions about probability. Did it really have to be a parent? What about a cousin or a grandparent? She could call her parents back in Poland. Peter grabbed her hand. What does it mean if we don't match? The doctor had not wanted to have this conversation in front of the boy, but Peter had insisted, and so Zosha had insisted too. We will, Zosha cut in. She cradled his hand. At 14, Peter had long since outgrown the age where he would readily let his parents hold him. Isaac had grown accustomed to this distance, but still. But now. He touched Zosha's arm. But if we don't, Peter continued, there will be something else we can do, right? If neither of your parents are an HLA match, our next course of action will be immunosuppression therapy. That has its own risks. Isaac had forgotten what HLA stood for, but he knew what it meant. In the absence of a sibling, their best chance was a parent. Zosha had already been tested. When the clinic phoned, informing her that she wasn't a match, she wept in silence. Isaac wept too, and they stood there, side by side but apart by the telephone in their kitchen, weeping. There was only a 1 in 200 chance of a parent being an HLA match. For anyone else, it was 1 in a million. It was incomprehensible, Zosha said later, that their child should come from them, be of them, and in this one respect be wholly separate. Zosha had brought him a kit from the clinic. Perhaps Isaac would be that 1 in 200 chance. The samples had to be sent to a lab. As far as Zosha knew, he was waiting for the results. Isaac had every intention of getting tested, but his hands had quaked when he opened the kit. It was just a swab of the cheek, but that swab seemed to carry with it the pain and terror of needles piercing his skin, of someone reaching inside and scooping out the material of his blood and bones. He saw himself unconscious on a table, with a stranger's hands on his hip. He watched the stranger drill holes in him. Isaac had been petrified of needles, let alone surgery, since he was 13, since the fragmentation, as he called it, since the man who touched him. It had happened just months after he and his parents came to New York. In this new country, his world had shrunk, then collapsed around him like a burst balloon. Isaac thought about how long the needle would have to be in order to reach the marrow, how many layers of skin and muscles it would tear through. His hands had started shaking so hard he couldn't grip the swab. His chest hurt. He couldn't stop feeling hands on him and an ache under his skin. He could hear the man's breath, so loud in his ears. He hadn't been able to do it in the end. Isaac left Zosha and Peter at the hospital after the meeting with the doctor. He told them he had to go to work, but he went home first. In the shed behind the snow gear was the kit. When he'd been drinking years ago, he'd stashed alcohol all over their home. He didn't always drink. He would have good periods. Then something would set him off. The worst time was when she told him she might be pregnant. It had taken 2 years for Isaac to gather the shards of himself back together and quit drinking. 2 years of his son's life that he could never get back. Isaac didn't think about what he was doing as he dug the kit out of its paper bag. In his head, he was baking. Step by step, he measured out the ingredients for challah. He mixed the dough the way his mother had taught him, cut it into strips and braided them. And when 3 cotton swabs were tucked back in their envelope, he sealed it, shoved it back in the paper bag, and tried to drive the whole thing from his mind. He got in his car, best to drop it off now, but when he approached the turn for the lab, he couldn't move his foot from the accelerator. There was that breathing again, so loud, so hot against his neck.
That was a wonderful reading.
Thank you.
So my first question is, what would you like to tell us about the history of this story?
Sure. So this story actually came about as part of a collection of linked stories that I was working on several years ago. And the stories are intended to stand alone, but there are recurring characters and other pieces that are interconnected. So the protagonist of this story, Isaac, does appear very briefly in another story. There's also a character who you didn't meet yet in that excerpt that I read, but you'll meet later on in the story, named Martin. And Isaac is his sponsor in AA. And Martin appears in other stories as well, including the story where we briefly meet Isaac before. And one of the things I loved about the form of interconnected stories, of linked stories, is the opportunity to see characters in different points in their lives, to see them from different perspectives. And so it was really appealing to me to explore that in this story with Isaac and his relationship with Martin, who again you meet later on in the story. I also, it was an interesting process for me to write this piece because and to edit it for publication in Bellevue, because I actually wrote it, like I said, many years ago, and as part of that collection, and I had sort of considered it done and kind of shelved it at a couple years back even, and then I was working on other writing projects and things like that, and when I saw the announcement, the call for submissions for this issue of Bellevue, I felt like I hoped it was a good fit and I wanted to submit it. So I looked again at the piece after probably 2 years, maybe without really looking at it. And at the time it was over 6,000 words long. And when I had been really fresh in writing and revising it, I hadn't been able to really have that distance to see what parts I could cut, where I could condense things or trim the story a little bit. And when I came back to it then, after that time away, I found it felt quite easy. Like I looked at it again and just thought, oh, okay, I can cut 1,000 words from this, no problem. And so went through that process and submitted it. And then we actually, you and I had a pretty substantive editing process as well once the piece was accepted for publication. And that was really interesting for me. I haven't having gone through an editorial process like that before in my career. And it was interesting too, because I had had to think on things that I like decisions that I had made when I was writing the piece that I didn't necessarily even remember what I had been thinking about. We particularly worked a lot on some of the details of his son's medical situation in this piece, and that was kind of funny because I had done all this research when I was writing it, and then didn't really remember it and had to go back and essentially do all the research over again to clarify a few points in this final version of the story. So that was that was sort of unique. I haven't done something like that before, like returning and revising a piece after such an extended period away, but it was really rewarding.
And how long was it again? 5 years, something like that?
I looked back in my files and I wrote the first draft of this story in 2016, and I think I was actually querying the whole collection for a brief period, I think in 2020, and then I sort of moved on to other writing projects. So I probably hadn't really looked at it at least since 2020, but even before then had probably considered it done for at least 3 years, probably.
I think that what you're saying should be very confirming for all the writers, or even not writers, anybody doing anything. It's something magical. Well, it's not magical. It makes all the sense in the world that you see it with fresh eyes, and you're just not as attached either. You can let go easier, right?
Exactly. Like back in when I was really fresh into revising it, I had thought about trying to cut it down because so many journals are looking for pieces that are under 5,000 words, and I couldn't think of it. Couldn't do it. Yeah, I was like, I need all of these words. I just couldn't see. It was, if it had been, just a couple hundred, that would. I'm sure I would have been able to figure it out at the time, but I couldn't see how to do it. And now looking at it, I can't even really remember where were the other 1,000 words. I don't even know. I'd have to go read other versions to remind myself. Now it seems so clear that they weren't essential and that the story was stronger with those changes.
Yeah. One of the things I really liked in this story, we talked about this a little bit, was the word you used, the word Isaac uses in his own mind for what happened to him, the fragmentation. And one of the power of that word, I think, is that it's not about the abuse, it's about the effect of the abuse. And you reinforce that quite a bit by his several times where there's a sense of him being separate from his body. And when we were talking about editing, at some point in the editing process, I asked you, when did this happen? Did this happen in Poland, or did it happen after he came to the United States? So do you want to talk about that word and that question?
Sure. Yeah, so as you heard in that excerpt, I did end up specifying in the story when this fragmentation, as he called it, this traumatic incident happened in his life, that it was after he came to New York. But before, earlier in the editing process, that detail wasn't spelled out in the story. And I actually hadn't spelled it out in any of the several years of revisions of different drafts. So I had to think about it. And when I thought about it, it seemed so clear to me that the incident had happened after he immigrated as a child. And there are a number of reasons for that, but mainly I felt that it touched on how vulnerable he would have been in that situation. Not just a child, but a child in a new country. And a lot of the reasons why he uses the word fragmentation, he never spells out what happened to him in really explicit language. And part of that was I felt that he had he had lost the ability to name it to himself or to anyone else in his life. And so I was interested too in this idea of someone who was multilingual. You know, he was an immigrant who speaks multiple languages, but he couldn't find the words in any language for what had happened to him. And so that's why he refers to it throughout the piece with the same word, fragmentation. And that was really like the core of the story from the very beginning, from every iteration, every draft over all the years, was the disconnect to his own body, the loss of his bodily autonomy, and how that affects him now as an adult, and how that plays into this decision that he has to make regarding his son and the need for a bone marrow transplant. And there are a lot of pieces that I tried to thread throughout where he is disconnected from his body in all these different ways. And even it shows up too in the way I think he connects to the other people in his life as well, his son and his wife in particular.
When you were reading, there was a line that really struck me, was how long the needle would have to be to reach the marrow. And I thought, what a great line that is. But it's the sense of, I mean, the marrow is the inside. It's what makes bone. And this is so buried so deep in him, and how long the reach is. The reach is so long that until he has to confront his son's possible death without supplying his own marrow, this never would have happened if he wouldn't make this breakthrough or tell his wife, which he eventually does in the story. I don't think I'm giving it away. But I just thought this story is powerful because if you had descriptions of the abuse itself, then people's attention would go more towards that. And this is about the effect of it. And that, I think, it's brilliantly woven in without being overdone.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, people had asked at various points if I would write out a scene or a memory that was more explicit or that detailed the sexual abuse, but I didn't. There are and it didn't really interest me. Like I said, the story is about the after effect, the recovery, to use the theme in the journal, and I really felt that and the impact with how he related to his own body was more important to me than sort of the details itself of the scene.
Yeah. And one of the things also we talked about was I really pushed you a lot to set up the story in a really clear way. And I felt like I was pushing and pushing. You were so great. You just came back with whatever needed to be there. So I wanted to know how that felt. And also we did cutting too, more cutting.
Yeah. So we several rounds of adding things, and then it became too long, so then cutting things again. It was a really interesting process. I mentioned before I haven't been through an editorial process like that previously, and I think part of the reason for some of the things that weren't included in the previous version of the story was because I had been looking at it in the context of the other pieces in the collection. So there were some details. For instance, one of the things that we worked on in the editing was just getting a clear sense of place, of even what town, what city they're in. And most of the stories in the collection had been set in the same area. And as I mentioned, Isaac himself had appeared in a previous story that's in the same place. So it hadn't really occurred to me that I needed to do that. And there were details around the medical situation was, I think, another one of the pieces that we worked on the most. And I've often find that I don't have I struggle to know what are the right details and like I struggle to to predict what the audience what the questions they're going to ask, or what they could potentially get hung up on if a detail isn't included. So again, I think that's like that perspective and that kind of distance from the story is really helpful to say, okay, wait, these are the things we need to spell out so that people aren't left wondering, people aren't getting kind of tripped up on those.
And that's where an editorial eye or someone else's eye can really be helpful.
Yes.
And I have to just give us BLR a little bit of credit, because really, I think that we do more hands-on editing than most journals, and very often it's about the setup at the beginning. It's not unusual. It's a very usual thing. Well, I think that we're running out of time, although I could keep talking and talking, because it's very interesting. And if we had more time, I would talk about the things that you haven't read yet in the story that were interesting. Well, I'll just say it really quickly. There was an AA. He's in AA, and he's a sponsor of someone else, but the person he's sponsoring actually helps him at certain points in the story. And that I just found that's really interesting too. Well, Julie, it was wonderful to work with you. It's a terrific story. I like to think it's even more terrific now, and it's a pleasure to hear you.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel like I could keep talking. We could talk about this for ages, but I know we've got other great writers to hear from as well.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Suzanne. And last but definitely not least is nonfiction. From Las Vegas, we're very pleased to welcome Ucheoma Onwutuebe. Ucheoma is the recipient of the Wasnode Fiction Prize and has received residencies from Yaddo, from Art Omi, and from the Anderson Center. Her writings have appeared in Prairie Schooner, Off Assignment, and Bakwa magazine. She's currently an MFA student at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Ucheoma will read an excerpt of her essay, A Nigerian Attempts Therapy, and then I will join in to ask a few questions.
Gender identity, female. I am a Nigerian woman plagued by Nigerian womanly problems. When I moved to America for graduate school last summer, I believed this new country would shield me from those nagging afflictions. I believed the shining billboards and neon signs of Las Vegas would shoo away the burdens that came with being a Nigerian woman. But like my accent, the ghosts of those problems marched right alongside me. During my first winter break, I spent the holidays in Wiley, Texas with my auntie. One evening, she invited me to join her at a meeting of Christian Nigerian women. I'd been attending a lovely Pentecostal church in Las Vegas, filled with sweet, kind people. But after 4 months away, I longed for the Nigerianness in the churches back home and jumped at my auntie's offer. We arrived late in the middle of praise and worship. The women were nurses, teachers, bankers, and new wives freshly imported from Nigeria. Some were dressed in hospital scrubs, others came with children in tow. The woman who led the songs wore a colorful Ankara gown and long winter boots, her outfit a blend of home and abroad. I'd forgotten how animated church could be. The music leader slapped the tambourine against her thigh with the throbbing music. The women bent at the waist, dancing and singing. Those familiar songs I did not realize how much I missed till I heard them again that evening. Songs I first sang in nursery school as we lined up for morning devotion. Songs my mother sang as she stirred a pot of okazi soup in the kitchen. I sang along, drenched in nostalgia, my eyes stinging with tears. I was home again. The common thread in all their testimonies was husbands, children, and marriage. Not one woman spoke about her own needs. I could feel my tears of joy drying up. I thought I'd left all that when I said goodbye at Nnamdi Azikiwe International Airport in Abuja. When the meeting ended, I knew what was to come. My auntie pulled me into a circle of women. "This is my little niece," she said, her voice dripping with pride. "She's a genius. She can write, eh? She and Chinua Achebe are in the same WhatsApp group. She came to America this August and she is already a graduate assistant in Las Vegas." "You don't mean it," they cried. "Congratulations, Nne. Is this the one that her father died some time ago?" "Yes," my auntie said. Yeah, they patted my back affectionately. "It is well, my dear. Welcome to America. Wow, she's a grown woman. Akojia, is any hand holding her?" "No hand is holding her," my auntie said, pushing me forward. "She is very, very single." "My dear," they said to me, "life does not consist of only writing and graduate assisting. You need a man. You need God's marital favor." Top concerns that bring you to counseling. Relationship problems. A certain boy is trying to bruise me, but my spirit is too strong for him. After experiencing Nigerian men's sweet love and their demonic wickedness, I am convinced there's no mountain I can't move, no valley I can't climb. I'm here only because I heard therapy is where bougie people come to toughen their hide against this cruel world. So I have come to receive additional powers that could make me even more invincible. It appears the creeds I learned on the streets back home are not enough for this American terrain. So I have come like an old dog for you to teach me new tricks. Are there words you never say to men in America? Words that may be fine with men in Nigeria, but taboo here? Words like atone. Because I asked this American man I'd been seeing to atone for canceling a date impromptu. Because hello, have you met me? You don't just cancel on women like me. And he said the word atone messes with his mental health, and it is triggering, and it is threatening to ruin all the mind work he's done on himself. His reaction surprised me, and that surprise brought me to this couch. I want to be like those people who balk at conflict because their therapist told them to flee at the first sign of drama. I want to be like those people who cancel dates because, sorry, my therapist says I should lie back in bed. In Nigeria, psychiatric treatment of any form is hidden like a dirty brass strap. Don't let anybody know that your brain is touching wires. Don't tell anybody that as you sleep, dark thoughts sit by your bedside. Who will marry your daughters if people know that someone in your family has a head that is not screwed on correctly? So people keep mum and walk around with mental health issues that go undiagnosed. But even if they were diagnosed, who could afford therapy? One time in Lagos, my mind was running in circles, relaying batons of worry. I Googled therapist near you. When I saw the astronomical price, my mind was cured immediately. Who needs therapy when you can blast music from your headphones and call up the man currently bruising you? But now that I am here in America and my health insurance covers it, I might as well indulge myself. I need a wise crack from this therapy session. I want to say, like other people, listen to what my therapist said to me that changed my life forever.
Ucheoma, thank you so much for that wonderful reading. And I'm thinking back to when we first read your essay back in the so-called slush pile, and
Yeah.
we don't typically judge books by their covers or really submissions by their titles, but
Yeah.
the title of this one really caught my eye. A Nigerian attempts therapy. And it
Yeah.
was the verb that was so intriguing, attempts. And it makes you feel like, okay, we're going to be in for an adventure, and
Yeah.
an adventure of observations, ironies, explorations, but things that are both personal and universal.
Yeah.
And can you tell us sort of how did this essay come to be?
Like I said, I had a little boy trouble there, and it was with an American person, and the comments he made me start questioning my identity, like if there was something inherently wrong with the way that I had perceived romance before coming to America. So I was in a messed up space at the time. So I decided to attempt therapy because I had heard my American friends say, oh, just when you go to a couch, your problems are resolved. So I decided to try it out because it's something that we only see that is quite prevalent in movies. But like I wrote in the essay, therapy is not like what the common person can access in Nigeria. So I wanted to take advantage of it, considering the boy trouble that I had at the time, to see if this thing would work for me. Yeah.
Well, did it work? Or did you recover?
When I got to therapy, the therapist told me that I did not need therapy. That I was a fool, like that I was well grounded as a person, and some things take time to heal, and that he doesn't think that everyone is made for therapy, and I am one of those people who do not require therapy. So I took it as a compliment, even to my Nigerian roots, to say that Nigeria has really prepared me for the tough things of life.
There are really three stories intertwined here.
Yeah,
There's your story of therapy in the wilds of Las Vegas.
yeah,
There's the story of your father, and there's the
yes,
story of Nigeria. And
yeah,
obviously, you could have written just a straight up essay about your adventures in college counseling. Why
yeah.
did you decide to expand it to include your father and indeed the whole country? And what was it like to write these three intertwining narratives?
It's hard to talk about being Nigerian without talking about how you are Nigerian. And, in the essay, I say our identity mostly springs from who our father is. So, being a Nigerian at therapy for the first time, I wanted to, bring in even the burden of that national identity and all the culture that frowns at mental health care. It was just hard to write about just that experience without digging deep about my roots and about my father. So my father's ghost always creeps into all my writings these days because I'm still like in a grieving process about his loss. So it's always hard to write anything without even one line mentioning him. So yeah.
Well, I'm curious, after writing this, do you look back at your culture and your country and your family in a different way now that you've gone through this writing process?
Uh, yes. You you realize you're really Nigerian when you are outside Nigeria. So, and it's an identity that I have come to love and sometimes question my love. It's just almost like a love-hate relationship. But when you are in America, it's just you're really aware that this is not your country, and you're filled with nostalgia for your own country. So, yeah, it's the writing process made me long for home, but also question the things about home that are not so beautiful. Yeah.
What was the reaction from your family or friends back home?
They haven't read it yet.
Okay.
I'm hoping, yeah, that I could share the link with them. I'm not enthusiastic for my mom to read this. Yeah, even though I have told her, oh, I wrote something in this nature. She's a huge fan of my work, but this is a particular piece that I'm not eager to share with her because it's very revelatory, and but I have prepared her and told her I wrote something that is quite sensitive, and I hope you'd forgive me when you read it. And she said, oh, I like everything you write, so I hope the reaction remains the same.
I'm wondering if you can tell us how you became a writer, I'm a doctor, I work in a hospital, and I know from all the Nigerians there that every Nigerian family expects their kids to become doctors.
Yeah.
And becoming a writer probably isn't in the plans for most parents. How did it come to be for you, and how did it go over?
Okay. Well, my father wanted me to actually be a doctor. He he was hoping that one day I would repent from this literary ambition and and become a doctor. But I studied microbiology, which was close enough to medicine. And when I started writing, it was mostly like a something he considered a hobby. That she has this little talent of writing. But when I quit my job at the bank to pursue writing full time, he never quite, I wouldn't say forgive me for that, but he never quite came around with the idea that I was pursuing writing full time. And most times when I write, I try to atone for, breaking his heart, to say that I could do well in this thing that you never really considered like a full-time career for me. And I'm always writing maybe that's why he always creeps into my writing, because I'm trying to convince him, even though in his absence, to say that this is something that I really love, and I might not have done well if I followed your dream for me by being a doctor. Yeah.
But writers have a very special role in Nigerian society.
Yes. Yeah. Um, they do, but the question is, what are the odds? Because Nigerians are super talented that it's hard to find. It's hard not to find a writer in every Nigerian family or even an artist. So when you're looking up to writers like Chinua Achebe and Chimamanda, the worry your parents would have is, what are the odds that you would reach those heights that they have reached? Why don't you just treat this as a hobby and do something more serious like medicine and law?
Right.
Yeah.
I guess the odds are better. As a doctor, you'll make a living.
Yes, you'll make a living, but as a writer, you might just end up in the streets as a hungry artist.
Or
So,
win a Nobel Prize, but could be. The odds are low.
yeah,
When your essay first showed up in our slush pile, it was 5,000 words, which was our maximum. But
yeah,
by the time it ended up on the printed page in the
yes,
journal, it was a svelte 3,700 words.
yes.
So I'm wondering if you can tell us, what was it like to have other people edit your work and to, add their ideas and slice out, a full quarter of the piece? What was that like?
I was heartbroken. But then I also realized that, as a writer, you are hogging a lot of ideas. You're fighting for some things that you could do without to be in the piece. So the editorial process is always like very helpful to remove yourself and let the reader, the editor, decide, oh, this is strong and this can be done without. So at first I really wanted every part of the piece to remain, but it's always good to take editorial counsel, and also to push back when you think that you're being asked to do much more than you would allow. But the editorial process was beautiful here. I enjoyed it. Yeah.
Well, we're glad it came out as a beautiful piece, and we're
Thank you.
so proud to publish it. And so please tell us, what's next for you? What's upcoming?
I am currently writing a column for Catapult magazine it's called Notes of a Nostalgic Nigerian. So where I continue this conversation of longing for home while being away. I am currently a second year in my MFA program at University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and I'll be graduating in 2024. Hopefully, I would come out with a novel or a collection of essays. So yeah, I'm facing schoolwork at the time, but also trying to make enough time to write my personal pieces. Yeah.
Well, they're wonderful. Ucheoma, thank you so much for this interview and for publishing this wonderful piece with BLR.
Thank you for giving my piece a home. I'm really grateful. It means a lot to me.
Thank you, Ucheoma. That was wonderful. We're now very pleased to present 3 more poems from BLR issue 43. Anthony Aguero will start us off reading his poem, Surviving You, and then Lolita Stewart-White will read How to Shield a Dark Body. And then Talia Bloch will read A Spring Without Us.
Surviving You, after nearly 7 years clean. I don't know how I did it. Loved you all those years in the quiet landscape of a burning vineyard, of a toppling mountain, of a drowned seascape, and had stayed attentive, at ease, hands behind my back, waiting for the soft hook following go. And the on and on insanity of day after day, of the hand reaching for the other hand, shaking it for its own pleasure, checking for the rhythmic music of my own pulse. And I don't know how I lived for myself all those years, lying on the cold surface of a man's bed, claiming Messiah, flesh of my flesh, and the stream of golden light escaping from him. I can't resist you, that velvet head lying on my chest, soft breath, and the unprotected extension of my hand to your bulging hand, non-sated, hungry and never really safe. I sit and think of you, our joist, our spar to spar, our never ending, and our last hour where you couldn't comfort me.
How to Shield a Dark Body, after Jericho Brown. I studied the creases of my husband's dark body. Dark body surgeons will dismantle come morning. There are countless ways to dismantle a dark body. Scalpel, whistle, rope. A whistle floats across the sky and spooks the night. At least that's the way my grandma tells it. The way my grandma tells the story of Emmett lingers, scent as loud as a wilted gardenia. Come morning, my husband may wilt like a gardenia. I want to pluck him from the garden to protect him. I want to protect my husband, but I don't know how. Is there any way to shield the dark body? Emmett's mama couldn't shield his dark body. I studied the creases of my husband's dark body.
A spring without us. The playground has been locked for months. A swing coughs dryly in the shade. Each night ambulances pulse through our sleep. Long white corridors crowd our dreams. Remember the scent of new grass in the park, of earth clotting in the rain. Remember the picnickers laughing beside the magnolia's soft pink lungs. Now we distrust even the breeze, and only the birds will congregate. The smallest gesture has grown grand, and from afar we've learned to love our neighbor's song. Our voices kiss the walls. Because we cannot, the tulip breathes.
Thank you, Anthony, Lolita, and Talia for those wonderful poems. Thanks again to writers Rochelle Robinson-Dukes, Julia Mascioli, and Ucheoma Onwutuebe. And of course to BLR editors Omotara James and Suzanne McConnell. Thank you to all the writers who contributed to BLR's 43rd issue on the theme of recovery, as well as all the editors and reviewers who bring this wonderful writing to the page. If you haven't gotten your copy of BLR yet, please visit us at www.blreview.org. You can browse plenty of previous videos and events. You can read poems, stories, and essays. It's all there. And we hope you'll join the BLR community as a subscriber. Your subscription makes you a patron of the arts. Your subscription helps nurture the writing you heard today and helps us continue to bring new voices to the table. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you at the next event.